My name is Joanne Witty, and I'm here at the invitation of Joni Kahn to talk about the lessons that can be learned from Brooklyn Bridge Park to help the process in Buffalo, which they seem to be embarking on, to create a park, or a project at least, in the Outer Harbor. And the reason I was invited was because I have been working at Brooklyn Bridge Park since 1998. I served in government before, and I'm a lawyer, but the reason I got involved was because I was appointed by my local state senator, who I knew from the soccer fields of Prospect Park, where our boys played together, and he knew I was an environmentalist and interested in these issues. I was appointed to the Local Development Corporation, created at that time by Brooklyn's local elected officials, and I ended up serving as the president for many years. And under my leadership, the 2000 master plan was created for the park. Thereafter, I served on the board of the ESDC subsidiary that was created, the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation, that further planned the park, and now I'm on the board of the Brooklyn Bridge Development Corporation, which is building and managing the park.
My name is Urbanski. I'm a landscape architect, a principal at Michael Van Valkenburgh Associates, landscape architects in Brooklyn, New York, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we were master planners and designers for Brooklyn Bridge Park, and we've been asked to come to Buffalo and tell everyone about our experiences of outreach to the public and design and construction of the park, and the lessons that can be learned from that process, and how to inspire people and how to get people excited about a park making process. The important thing from a community perspective is to be very inclusive, to get as many different people involved in the process as you can, even people that aren't immediately next to the project, and get them excited about it, get their input into it, get their ideas and creativity. So as plans emerge, they feel invested in the projects, and I would say that was the most important aspect of community involvement. Absolutely, community involvement will break or make your project. Lack of it will break it, and you have to try very hard to get that to work. So you can't necessarily have a plan and just stick to it stubbornly. You need to adapt the plan as you see how it's working, and then come try new methods. You want to try the internet. You want to try meeting face to face. You want to use large groups. You want to use small groups. You have to be adaptable about how you do it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this good volume? Great. I'm Joni Kahn. I'm co-chair of the 21st Century Park on the Outer Harbor, along with Joan Bozer. And on behalf of our whole committee, I'm so pleased that all of you could be here today. We have an opportunity to learn. We have an opportunity to learn from the founders of the Brooklyn Bridge Park how we can transform our waterfront so it can become the incredible asset it deserves to be. We thank them for their willingness to come here today to share their experiences with our community. We're very grateful to the Community Foundation for making this forum possible. We thank the Saturn Club, and we thank Jerry Kelly for making this space available to us. We're pleased to have our elected officials here and their representatives, waterfront planners, community leaders, and members of the ECHDC, and the new ECHDC advisory panel. I'd like the officials to stand up when I say their names, but we're pleased to have Robert Joya here, who is the chairman of the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation. And we have Sam Hoyt here, who is the regional president of the Empire State Development Corp. And we have, I forget his name, okay. But we also have members of the advisory committee and the ECHDC board. And for those of you who are present, would you please stand? Thank you. Let's see. We want to thank our coalition member groups for supporting us and attending today. They're listed on the information sheet that you have. And lastly, Joan Bozer and I would like to thank our steering committee members. And I would like all of them to stand up, please. Jim Carr, Gary Phillips, Cheryl Orlick, Laura Kirkpatrick, Sarah Gatti, Derek King, Austin Sanders, Marika Woods Frankenstein, and Carol LaDuca, and Marcy Phillips. We have an unprecedented opportunity to make an indelible mark on our community. We have in our city one of the largest undeveloped urban waterfronts in the Northeast. It rests at the headwaters of the mighty Niagara River, which is part of one of the greatest waterfronts in the world. If planned and executed properly, it could be transformational for Buffalo. With imaginative connections, it not only could become part of a regional attraction, it could become an international gateway park, and it could also function as a neighborhood park to downtown. It could function as a neighborhood park to downtown, to the Cobblestone District, and to the Old First Ward. It would connect over 50 miles of bikeways, greenways, and waterways, all the way from Lake Ontario down the Niagara River to Lake Erie. And that is just how the Niagara Greenway Commission envisioned it to happen. Cities like Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Cleveland have re-energized themselves by revitalizing their waterfronts. Contributing to Chicago's vibrancy is the fact that it has 19 miles of publicly accessible waterfront. The New Millennium Park in Chicago has quadrupled tourism in its downtown. And we look to Brooklyn Bridge Park for creatively financing its operations and maintenance costs. We think there are creative solutions to do something like that here. Our primary goal is to lift the quality of life in Buffalo. We want to create an exciting destination that will be part of a blueprint to retain and recruit talented people to Buffalo. That's our overarching goal. We want to preserve and protect this valuable land for public access. Olmsted planted the seed for this idea with his design for the original South Park long ago. And now, after 120 years and countless outer harbor plans, we have a second chance to do something that befits a city called the best planned city in the world. And there's a new book out entitled The Best Planned City in the World. We want this park to be self-sustaining, both ecologically and financially. And that is why we have two of the founders of the Brooklyn Bridge Park here today to explain how they managed to do just that in Brooklyn on the East River. We have Joanne Witty and Matt Urbanski. And our moderator today is Sam Magavern. Sam is a public interest lawyer who currently serves as the co-director of the Partnership for the Public Good. PPG provides research and advocacy support to a broad array of partners that share a vision of a revitalized Buffalo-Niagara region. He also teaches at the University of Buffalo Law School and was just appointed to serve on the Niagara River Greenway Commission. PPG is part of a coalition of Buffalo groups that recently received a $1.9 million grant from the Open Society Foundations. The grant, one of 3 awarded nationwide, will be used over 2 years to address issues of justice and equity and develop the next generation of civic leaders. And now I'd like Sam to take over and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
It's really an honor to be part of this event. Like many people, I've fallen under the spell of Joan and Joni and their team, and I haven't told them yet, but I actually have an idea for a Masterpiece Theater detective series starring Joan and Joni as the detectives that I think would make enough money to finance the 21st Century Park. So I will be working on that in the future. But it's really a privilege to introduce these incredible speakers to you today. Joanne Witty is an attorney and an environmental activist. She has a rich and varied career, having worked in private practice, as counsel to the Ford Foundation, and served in both New York City and New York State government. She's been vice chair of the board of the National League of Conservation Voters, and also sits on the board of the Environmental Defense Action Fund. She is a central figure in the creation of Brooklyn Bridge Park, as president of the local development corporation that created the master plan, as a director of the New York State agency that began construction of the park, and now as a director of the Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation that will complete construction and operate the park. Matthew Urbanski is a principal of Michael Van Valkenburgh Associates, where he has worked for over 2 decades. He has planned and designed landscapes in the United States, Canada, and France, including waterfronts, parks, college campuses, sculpture gardens, and private gardens. Collaborating with Michael Van Valkenburgh, he has served as lead designer of Segment 5 of the Hudson River Park in New York City, Alumni Valley at Wellesley College, Allegheny Riverfront Park in Pittsburgh, Teardrop Park in New York City, and of course, Brooklyn Bridge Park. So please join me in giving a warm Buffalo welcome to Joanne Witty and Matthew Urbanski.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone who's attending. It's actually a pleasure to be in Buffalo, where I've never been before, and it's great to see such a big turnout, because this is a really important issue, as it was in Brooklyn. I've never been to Buffalo, as I said, and we had a quick tour this morning with Joni and Joan, and saw the site, obviously, and amazing industrial infrastructure. The grain silos, the Ford motor plant, the Bethlehem steel site, Quaker Oats, and it was really moving, really moving to see that kind of industrial infrastructure that's been largely abandoned. In New York City, we had a slightly different problem. It's certainly in the site for Brooklyn Bridge Park we did, although the Navy Yard was right up the road from us, where we went from 60,000 jobs to 6,000 jobs in a very, very short period of time. Happy to say that part of Brooklyn is reviving, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation has many businesses operating in the Navy Yard now. And it's a totally different concept, but it's a highly successful one that provides jobs and economic activity in Brooklyn. And hopefully your park will be part of that same process. Michael Van Valkenburgh likes to talk about the glacier receding from the waterfront. And as that occurred, really everywhere in this country, commercial and manufacturing, highways, all of the things that kept people from the waterfront, all of a sudden became obsolete, these things. And that's a really exciting conversation. In Brooklyn, it was containerization in the port that led to this conversation. And when
containerization became the mode of transportation for goods coming into the port moved to New Jersey. There really was not enough upland in Brooklyn to sustain large container ports. And all of a sudden, an industry that employed thousands and thousands of people employed no one. And we had empty piers on the Brooklyn waterfront that the Port Authority did not want, didn't have any economic use for, didn't want to maintain them, and really just wanted to leave at a time when Brooklyn was suffering and people didn't really want the Port Authority to go. They didn't want to lose jobs. They didn't want to lose any more jobs. And it was a time of high crime. There was a crack epidemic. There had been no investment in the housing stock in New York City for a very long time. Parks like Central Park and Prospect Park were dirty, run down, scary. It was not a good time. It was not a good time for the city of New York, and it was not a good time for Brooklyn, especially. And at that time, the Port Authority, in its effort to get rid of these piers, came up with many different ideas of commercial development, and these ideas went in and out of fashion depending on the moment of the day. At one point they thought maybe the Chinese, who were worried about the imminent takeover of Hong Kong by the mainland Chinese government, maybe they could be interested in, always think about foreigners taking over, making investments that nobody else who knows anything about the property will do. And eventually, they tried one thing after another, and we, unlike you, had a community that was quite nearby to this site, and that was very powerful and organized, Brooklyn Heights. And they didn't want just anything to happen on the piers below their neighborhood. They cared a lot about this. And they fought for a long time against various options that the Port Authority put out. But eventually, opposing things was not sufficient. You really needed to have a plan of what an alternative vision could be for this site. And it had to be something that was viable. It couldn't just be some pie-in-the-sky idea that you could lay out there and hope the government paid for it. This was not a time when the government had a lot of money to be doing frivolous projects. And at that time, when everyone else in the city was worrying about economic development, there wasn't much interest in building what was then proposed as an all-green park with absolutely nothing in it except maybe a conference center and a few restaurants to support it. And so for a long time we were at a standstill. And it wasn't really until the late 1990s that things began to change. And that was partly because the economics began to change. Brooklyn by then was slowly but surely revitalizing. The borough president at the time had been absolutely dogged about economic development in Brooklyn, and he had succeeded in getting something called MetroTech built, which at the time was a huge urban development project that created commercial space, back office space for banks and Wall Street firms in Brooklyn instead of having them go to New Jersey. There was an opportunity, and the borough president took it. But you should know that even when MetroTech was built, it was inward looking. It didn't look out at the rest of Brooklyn. It had gates. The people who worked there were bused from Grand Central to this site. They didn't even want to take the subway. So we were still in a period of just seedlings beginning with MetroTech and then additional buildings and then a hotel, the first hotel that had been built in Brooklyn since the St. George. It was an astonishing time. So as these economic developments began to kick in, then the idea of nurturing them, keeping them going, and the notion that the park could add to the vitality of Brooklyn and be another part of this renaissance began to grow on the part of everyone. And the local elected officials at that point decided, okay, we need to create an entity that is very broad-based, very representative, that could actually try to come up with a plan that would be viable. The government might be able to do it, the Port Authority might be willing to give up the piers for it. Let's give it a try. And they created the Local Development Corporation. And this was the borough president, our congresswoman, our state senator, our assemblywoman, city council members. And they created this 15-member body that included not just Brooklyn Heights, but all of the surrounding neighborhoods, and not just the neighborhoods. It included the Chamber of Commerce, it included the 2 community boards, which had a much wider geographic reach, and the elected officials, who covered also an overlapping but different constituency, each elected their own representatives. And the idea was that this group somehow, which was reflective of the community at large, would be able to work together, come up with a plan of some kind, work with the Port Authority, because at this time we were talking primarily about Piers 1 through 5 in Brooklyn, and create something that everybody could join behind and get it done. And one ingredient that I have to say was essential was money. We had funding from member items from our legislators that began with $1 million and eventually ended up with $2.1 million. And it was a little money from the Pataki administration, the Department of State, but the rest of it came from the legislature. And we used that money to 15 lay people, most of whom had full-time jobs. We used it to hire very serious professionals, which in the same way that the ESDC subsidiary here is about to do. We put out an RFP, we hired a chief consultant, people who could be our staff. And we hired HR&A, which is a firm in New York that has a lot of experience in public projects, but with real estate aspects. They knew government, they knew real estate, they knew numbers, and they were the perfect choice for us in this circumstance. And they helped us map out a plan of what we needed to do in order to deal with the government and create a plan. I mean, the first thing was to create a plan. What we needed to do to create a master plan. And the next step, therefore, was to hire a master planning team. And we put out an RFP for that. Many people, many firms actually replied, and I believe that was in part due to the legitimacy that HR&A had in the field. They got a lot of people interested, and we hired a team that was headed by Ken Greenberg from Urban Strategies, and I know you are also dealing with Urban Strategies, although Ken Greenberg was no longer there. But the reason we picked them was precisely because they had experience on waterfront development in cities. These were people who understood parks in cities, and they understood waterfront. And that combination was irresistible. They also understood communities. They were real humanistic, they were humanists. And they hired under them Michael Van Valkenburgh and Associates, and Matthew. That's when I first met Matthew. So that was something like maybe 99 or 2000. And we had a huge team. We had master planners, we had landscape architects, we had engineers, we had people that specialized in noise because our site is on the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, and the noise reverberating off the expressway was horrific. We had people who knew about marine structures because so much of our site is on piers and other kinds of bridge-like structures. We hired traffic specialists because that was another big issue. It had to do partly with how do you get to the site. It's not at grade with most of the community, and it's a little isolated. And there was a lot of concern at that point about whether people would take mass transit, whether they would drive their cars, and if they drove their cars, we had to worry about where they were going to put their cars, and then how we would get them to the site. So we had people of all stripes and varieties working on this project. Not just a community process where you post your meeting on the website and whoever comes, and you end up with a group of people who are extremely interested. It's kind of like a primary, where the people who show up for the primary tend to be the extremists in both parties. This is what will happen if you don't reach out to a very, very broad audience. And top-down planning, I can tell you, from my experience and the experience of all the people who worked on this project, and others we talked to, top-down doesn't work. Even if it's a brilliant idea, it doesn't work, because it's against human nature. If you present people with a fait accompli and say, isn't this beautiful and great, they are going to say no in a very knee-jerk reaction. Whether it's right or not, it's just what they're going to do. And so we went to extraordinary lengths to create a really unique public planning process. We had, first of all, our outreach was unbelievable. Not only did we advertise in the newspapers, post on community bulletin boards, send out mass emails, we also engaged all the organizations that had anything to do with us to go out there and get their people in. We went to the schools, public and private schools. We went to religious institutions. We even held a meeting in the Masonic Temple in Fort Greene. We talked to museums, we talked to hospitals, we talked to senior centers, we talked to social service agencies, recreational groups, Boys and Girls Club, the Y, you name it. We put flyers up in the projects. We were everywhere, dragging people out to these sessions. And we wanted not just a socioeconomic and racial cross-section, we also wanted the diversity of users. So we had our planning sessions on a Sunday afternoon, on a Monday morning, and a Monday evening. So we got every kind of possible person there, the people who had kids, the people who worked during the day and could come at night. We got people who were from institutions who came during the day. And we made a huge effort to reach out to everyone, because the people who aren't there will come back to bite you. So I think I cannot emphasize enough that the need to have everybody at the table, because the object here is to create a common set of facts from which everyone operates. If you don't have people playing with the same deck of cards, you will not be able to have a rational process, you will not be able to make trade-offs and compromises. And that was our experience. We started at the beginning with these sessions. We opened it up broadly and said, okay, what are the opportunities here? What is everybody, when you see this site, what do you think about? And then we introduced the constraints. You know, the site is long and narrow, you need to have a way to get around it. It's in our case, we didn't need a lot of remediation, but you may need a lot of remediation. What all the limitations are. Can you put weight on the piers? It turns out, no, you can't. So we tried to introduce as much of the known constraints as we could and get people to start to focus in on the possible, what they wanted in relation to the possible. And unless you do that, and you continue to do it over and over, and you adjust as you go along based on what you hear, I think it's very difficult to reach a consensus that is also realistic. So I would say, from what I've heard about Open Buffalo, and I also know you're near Lackawanna, and even though those people are not on the park or on the site in the same way that you are, we brought in many, many people who were not on the site, and they all contributed, and they're all using the park now. So the process is not easy, it's contentious, but eventually, amazingly, people get to see that the goal is more important than their own self-interest. And I have to say that given some of the communities we had to deal with, if we can do this, I have absolute confidence that this is a winning strategy pretty much anywhere. So the second thing I would say that's really important is having these guiding principles. I'm sorry, as an aside, having the guiding principles which you now have, we found to be enormously helpful as well. We had 13 guiding principles. I think you guys have seen them. And they help focus the conversation, and they really provide structure to everybody's thinking about it. So I urge you to continue to use that mechanism. Now, I mean, if you look closely at them, some of them are conflicting. But that's okay. You can work, you have to work through that with people and get them to see that there are trade-offs. If they want certain things, they have to give up other things. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in the forefront. The other thing is design excellence is unbelievably important. We had a first-class team of people working on this project. And even after the master plan was done, which was really just a concept plan, Matthew's going to show you all of the design work, but I mean, the master plan is really a concept plan. It doesn't have any detail at all, but it was really important to set the stage. But what happened after that was, after we in fact ended up having an ESD subsidiary created for us as well, the Brooklyn Bridge Development Corporation, because we had ownership of land by different government entities. It was mostly public, but it was the Port Authority, the state of New York, and the city. And all three of those had to work together, which was very tricky, and it's luckily something you don't have to necessarily contend with, except that you do have localities here who are operating, and it would be nice to have everybody on the same page. But when our subsidiary was created, we then put out another RFP for a design team, and Michael Van Valkenburgh Associates applied. Some people didn't want them in the next round because they thought, well, you know, these guys are too wed into ideas that were generated early, and you know, maybe we need to start fresh. And luckily, better heads prevailed, because the very fact that they had experience with this site and the community and the process was so important to getting a good design, and the process continued. At some point, obviously, Matthew has to draw, and he can't have the community looking over his shoulder. And sometimes it's hard to shut that off, because there always are people in the community who think that, well, community process means they're sitting at the same drafting table, you know, and they're moving I don't want this thing there, move it over there. But we were pretty successful in getting people to back off. We created an advisory council. We met with them when we made changes in the plan. We discussed why we were doing it. And we had to. We had to make changes in the plan for all kinds of reasons. Some engineering, some economic. You know, it turned out that our marine structures were in much worse shape than we had been told earlier by the Port Authority, but even by our own engineers. And so we had places that were going to be so expensive to repair and continue to repair that we decided to just pull them up and put in riprap and other sorts of, and create marsh and do all sorts of things like that that weren't in the original plan. And we just kept bringing people along, and as long as they were apprised of what was going on and they didn't see any surprises, they were fine with that, and it worked very well. And but the real issue eventually became cost, because the way you, and this is our third issue, financial self-sufficiency. From an early stage, really, the notion of self-sufficiency was accepted by everyone. The community accepted it. It really started early because the government was saying, look, we can't do this. We can't build a park and then also maintain it. And the community was willing to acknowledge that that was a hard nut to crack. And they were willing to have self-sufficiency. But, of course, the question of self-sufficiency depends on how much money is required to actually sustain yourself. And that is directly related to the kind of a park you design. And therefore, you really back into the question of how much revenue you have to generate on the site. And so I think we all agreed that beyond the kind of grudging acceptance of self-sufficiency, a lot of us believe that it would be good for the park to have revenue generating activities, because they enliven the park. They're good for the park. You know, we didn't want to have a park that was empty at certain times of the day or certain times of the year. We wanted things to be going on there all the time. And recreation in and of itself doesn't do that. So we were looking for things that would be compatible with a park that would also generate revenue. And we looked at a lot of things. And the community didn't like some of them, and we didn't like some of them. But eventually, we sort of had a tentative idea until we discovered that instead of having to deal with the $10 million annual operating budget, we were actually dealing with a $15 million annual operating budget. And that was driven primarily by the cost of maritime maintenance. And I mean, our park is sitting on thousands and thousands of pilings, which are eaten by marine borers and which have to be repaired all the time. And so you must have a schedule of repair, or else the piers will fall in the water, as many have. And that is where you must start when you think about your budget. In addition to that, you know, we had to keep it safe, and as for the other costs, we did a volume of approximately this size, comparing every single cost item in the park with other parks around the city, around the state. How much does it cost to repair a paver? How much does it cost to mow an acre of land? How much does it cost to spray a tree? How much does it cost to replace a bench? What about the lights? So we had, and we did it many times to make sure that we were correct. So we knew what the maintenance of the park was. We knew what the cost would be of securing the park. We knew insurance, utilities. We knew all of that. The wild card always was the maritime repairs, and it turned out they were extraordinarily high. And that changed the ballgame for us when we realized we had to raise $15 million a year. And after another look at all of the possible options, we eventually decided that residential development was the best option. And that was because it provided the most revenue on the smallest footprint, and it was the most compatible with our other objectives, which is having eyes on the park, having people there 14/7, 12 months a year. We thought it was the best choice available to us. And we chose 3 development sites, and we went to the community with it. And this happened just before we went through an environmental review process. The community was not happy. And to be honest, I think part of the problem laid with us. And again, I hark back to the community process. For a variety of reasons that had to do with timing, I don't think we laid a sufficient foundation with the public about this shift from $10 million to $15 million in our budget. And because we didn't spend enough time with them, explaining it to them, and making sure they all understood where it was coming from, they turned on us. And they thought we were being dishonest. They thought that the numbers couldn't possibly be true. They thought that they shouldn't have to pay capital maintenance, that we should ask the government to do it. Why should we have to absorb another cost? And there was just, and some people felt quite philosophical about it. No, the government is supposed to pay for a park, and housing in a park is an anathema. It's hideous. Like, how could we do this? In fact, we were sued about it. And the Supreme Court said, sorry, this isn't really a park, because it wasn't a park before. It was just a collection of piers with automobiles and lumber and junk. And these people are making it into a park. So how can you say they can't have housing in a park? This is nuts. The only way they can have a park is with the housing. And there's no constitutional requirement that the government has to pay for a park. So I think we've established beyond a doubt that the model that we use is legal, and we feel very much comfortable with it. Some people are afraid of privatization. Our experience is the opposite. We started with a 1 million square foot building in the middle of this park that was private property. And it changed hands from the Jehovah's Witnesses to a private developer for $200 million. There was nothing we could do about that, despite the fact that some people said we should condemn it. Of course, when you condemn something, you still have to pay for it. So that wasn't really a suitable response. But when that happened, we were able to bring that building also into our plan and have them contribute first through a ground lease payment, and ultimately with the cooperation of the City of New York, with a pilot payment that was made directly to the park, with the idea that we would capture the revenue. So we don't have to ask for appropriations. The money is collected by our ESDC subsidiary. It goes into our bank account, and it's regenerated to pay the maintenance on the park. And the first model for that was this building that previously was in private hands. The Jehovah's Witnesses did not pay tax. The city was willing to forego the tax that would have been paid and have it go directly to the park. And we passed legislation that permitted us to do that. Our other development sites are operating on the same basis, except that they are owned by us. So we don't have to engage in any sort of a separate transaction. So that's the way our park works. We think, we have experience with 360 Furman, with all these people living there. It is not privatizing the park. They're out playing soccer, just like everybody else. They're running in the morning, they're biking, everything is going extremely well. And the people who show up to this park, of course, have no idea how any of this happened. But they would be amazed by the complexity. All they know is that this is a fabulous place to come and play and see cultural events. I mean, our soccer fields are operating until 11 o'clock every night, same with sand volleyball. We've got, the park is lively and very well enjoyed, not to mention all the awards that we've won. So I guess I would say to you, the process is messy, be prepared. It's contentious, but certainly what we found was with perseverance and patience and vision, you can get it done, absolutely. And just don't forget about the inclusive planning process, which will lead you to a broad consensus backing a good plan. And I think you'll have a very good result. And from what I understand about all the other great things going on in Buffalo, the timing is perfect for this kind of a project. So I'm delighted to help in any way, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to share Brooklyn Bridge Park's experience. Thanks.
What does the site offer uniquely to this neighborhood? Because there were some parks, including possibly Olmsted's greatest park, Prospect Park, which is inboard over here, you can see on the lower right corner. So what does the site offer uniquely? What does the site offer as a waterfront site? And how could we leverage those particular qualities to make Brooklyn Bridge Park? That was part of our charge. Next, please. The site, historically, on the lower left, you can see, was an established neighborhood for a long time, and that's looking down from Brooklyn Heights, a historic image there, where you're looking down into the harbor. On the upper right, you see the Battery in Manhattan, which was really the only public waterfront in New York. In terms of a promenade or something like that. That's all the way back in 1823. But New York waterfront was an industrial place for working, and the layout of the city was all about that. On the lower right, you can see Brooklyn Heights and our site, our future site, and the relationship in this historic drawing of the kind of escarpment or the 60-foot high cliff that looked down over what is the site, and people actually. Shipping people actually lived in houses at the top of the hill, walked through a garden down to their business at the bottom of the hill. So that's how that worked. Next, please. But by the late 1990s, the site more or less looked like this. And what you see here is a consequence of the modernization of the site to be a cutting-edge break bulk shipping terminal. And if that sounds slightly ironic, it is. They made it a break bulk shipping terminal in 1957, but failed to notice that the shipping container had already been invented. So that it was sort of like a state-of-the-art steam-powered car. The other thing you can see is a kind of brilliant engineering project called the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which didn't go through Brooklyn Heights above, was put into the escarpment there, but was a rather noxious neighbor to a waterfront, right? Didn't matter when you were just unloading ships, but if you're going to make a park, it's a different matter. Next, please. So in these two drawings here, you can see on the left is the kind of this scope of the park. It went all the way from, it goes all the way from Pier 6 on Atlantic Avenue at the top of the picture, and sweeps all the way underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, underneath the Manhattan Bridge, and actually goes off of the picture. About 1.3 miles long on the inboard side, 2.4 miles long on the outboard side. And our vision for it is shown on the right, although that almost can be replaced with a photograph now, so probably should do that. Some of the middle pieces aren't quite finished yet, but a lot of that park is now finished. I'll show you that next week. So Joanne alluded to this. The Port Authority was stuck with these piers, and you can see here as the plan is turned, but Pier 1 is the big one on the top on the left, and then Pier 2, 3, Pier 4 is shown as a harbor, and Pier 5, and then Pier 6 are shown there on that plan from the Port Authority of 1987. So their thought was the responsible thing to do would be to monetize the asset and make it into a housing project, and kind of be responsible about their stewardship of this land, and oh, by the way, get rid of it, right? So they don't have to maintain it anymore. That didn't go over well, as Joanne explained, with the Brooklyn Heights Association, who were up in their drawing rooms in the Brooklyn Heights, deciding that that wasn't a good idea. So they hired somebody, and he drew up a neat plan there, you can see, and it was important in that it said, hey, let's make this a park, and it also acknowledged the fact that this was, the late 80s, 90s, not easiest time in New York City, yes, it probably needs to be self-sufficient too. They kind of guessed at what that cost would be. Turns out they were off by a power of 10, but they did guess at a number that probably sounded really high to them, $1.5 million. You already know what it really is now. They had a vision of a park drawn up. It was great for all those reasons, and that it was community generated. It was not great because it didn't have everybody behind it. It was a kind of a little bit top-down community planning, if you could combine the two phrases together. Okay, so next. So actually this is a little bit out of order because we started taking more pictures in public meetings later on when we realized we should, but I'm a little bit later in the process, but Joanne talked a lot about the inclusiveness, and I would just say one thing, we really reinvented how we did this all the time. You know, big meetings, small meetings, storefronts, mailing out postcards, websites, and of course, didn't even kind of exist when we first started, or barely, and then by the end were very, very important. And so reinventing, so you don't kind of have a process and stick to it, like, which is the normal planning method. Kind of, yeah, I did the process, check. It was more about really actually trying to be inclusive. And using a lot of three-dimensional models is one of our hallmarks, as you can see here next, please. So the top plan is what I might call Joanne's plan, which is she was the leader of the LDC, or Local Development Corporation. It's HRNA working for her. And really this plan established ultimately it secured money from the governor and the mayor. So that's really good, right? When you have money committed. But it did that by being a more inclusive process and showing all of the enthusiasm, exciting people, making the 13 principles, establishing the economic model of self-sufficiency, and also part of it was establish the idea that we could use 20% of the project area for revenue generating use to pay for the operation of the park. Then the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation was formed, as Joanne explained, and they ultimately hired us, Michael Van Valkenburgh Associates, to be the lead planners and designers for this urban design project called Brooklyn Bridge Park. And that's shown on the bottom. And so the top plan, which had a kind of heuristic level or common sense level of input on engineering and economics and design, but couldn't really super engage in that as well as do all the community process. Our process that produced the plan, which we're building on the bottom, was much more metrics based. It was much more based on a close reading of the site from an engineering perspective, starting with that, saying what are the assets and liabilities of the site. Again, a whole extensive community outreach process, and again, a very rigorous economic analysis so we were asked as the lead planners of this project to plan an urban design plan that would contain a park that you were to design, and then simultaneously figure out what the maintenance budget would be, and then figure out where in the urban design plan would best be the revenue generating uses that would balance the cost of that maintenance budget, and what those uses would be, what type of uses they would be. It's lots of balls in the air at the same time, but I think it actually resulted in a better plan because all of those things can react to each other. Next, please. So the landscape architect and the client, which was a client at that point in time, by the way, and I think it's very important for Wendy Leventer to get the credit for this. This is the woman who worked for the state at the time and was the president of the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation, and she had a helper, and that was it, okay? Kind of interesting. So we were working with her. We were almost being her client, her owner's representative at the same time, and it was our job to get this gigantic constellation of participants from the city, from the federal government, from the state government, and from all of the community groups together around a plan, kind of create enough gravity in the middle there to pull them all together. Next, please. So again, on the top is just a diagram saying, so the normal plan for park maintenance is sometimes you have money for it and sometimes you don't. And people say, well, that's what you should do. You should stick with that plan. It's the government's responsibility. My observation about that is sometimes the time that you don't have the money for it is 50 years long. Like in Central Park, when it was turned into a wasteland from basically the 30s to the 80s until Betsy Barlow Rogers saved it. So if you're willing to have that happen, then you can stick with that plan. But our idea was to try to balance the cost of maintenance. We're not talking about capital cost here. We're not talking about construction costs, which was borne almost entirely by the government, or state and city government, but the ongoing maintenance cost, which adds up over time. In the case of Brooklyn Bridge Park, in 20 years, you equal the capital cost every 20 years. So Central Park's 150 years old, okay, every 20 years. So we evaluated all the different uses. That's what that means on the bottom there. We looked at parking, we looked at retail, we looked at office, we looked at commercial. And we ultimately decided, as Joanne said, that residential, which is compatible with being next to a park, of course, all the great parks in the world have residential next to them, and hotel, which is also often found next to a park, were the best uses to give us the money we needed. Next. So out of that process also, and a physical reading of the site, we realized we needed these things we called urban junctions, where these moments where the city and the park came together in a more intense way, where there would be something, next please, more like a neighborhood park amenity. So that's the question is, can your park function as a neighborhood park, or is it only a regional attraction or something that takes a long time to get to? These are very important things. It also might change over time, right? Where we did a park in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where there was nothing along the edge of the park, but the point of making the park was to encourage something to happen, and now there is something. And that's a proven model as well. The urban junctions happen down at the Atlantic Avenue on the south and up at the Brooklyn Bridge in the middle there, and then more towards the top up in the Dumbo area near the Manhattan Bridge. And then the more regional attractions like kayaking and recreational facilities, they happen more towards the middle, which are a little harder to get to. Next, please. So here is an aerial view, a little out of date, of the Fulton Ferry Landing down at Pier 1. So if you can see on the key plan there on the lower right, you see the red arrow where we are. So we're looking at the historic place where Fulton had his steamboat that took people across the river before there was a Brooklyn Bridge. These buildings, a lot of these buildings existed before the Brooklyn Bridge. That's how old the neighborhood is. This is also where George Washington evacuated the Continental Army and saved. We wouldn't, probably be discussing this otherwise, but lots of interesting found objects. I like to think of them as there, and we worked around them in a very humble way. And then on Pier 1, you see the brown area there. That is one of our revenue-generating properties. That is a hotel and residential building that is actually further along than is shown on that photograph right now. And you can see the entrance to Pier 1, which is actually landfill. So we were able to make a big hill on Pier 1, 30 feet high. Next, please. This is at the wine bar. If there was one recurring theme, Joanne's laughing, if there was one recurring theme in public meetings, is that I want to drink wine in the park.
White.
White wine. It got to be almost hysterical. But you can. Look at that view back to Brooklyn Bridge, and this is the Brooklyn Bridge wine bar. Next, please. And these are people watching a movie in this part of the park, where you're kind of sweeping up that hill that I just described that we made, and looking back at the kind of sublime industrial beauty of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge. Next, please. And or over on the Harbor View lawn, where we can put up a temporary stage. We have an inflatable screen. We have movies. I shouldn't say we. The Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy runs movies. That's a park programming organization, runs movies on Thursday night in the summer. This is actually the opera, and like you can see here, we have a pretty nice borrowed landscape. we can get 8,000 people on that lawn, or you can have 2 people on that lawn, and it works for both. That's one of the great things about landscape as a medium. Next, please. Connecting the park to the city became very important, and because of these few nodal places that we could connect. And one idea that we had that everybody liked was to make a new pedestrian bridge, and we call it the Squid Park Bridge because it connected from an existing park into the site. Next, please. And so I think bridge building is probably in your future too. I think it should be. Public spaces need lots of connections. And you can see the Squid Park Bridge here was very innovative. It is a wooden bridge in New York City, a modern wooden bridge in New York City. So you can see it built here. Next, please. Down at the other urban junction at Pier 6, you can look at the arrow there, is at Atlantic Avenue, a major avenue in Brooklyn, goes basically all the way to JFK Airport. And you can see here explicitly what I mean by a neighborhood park amenity. This is a nearly 3-acre play garden. And one of the park planning principles that I've always absorbed is that people don't want to walk too far for a playground. They're already pushing somebody in a stroller and they're going to have to take them home again. So you put it right at the entrance, and that's what it is down here. And it's a big kind of welcoming greeting to ostensibly the younger neighborhood to the south. They like to pretend they're poorer, but that's just kind of a pretense. And then immediately to the south of that, by the way, is an active beer importing pier. Next, please. And this is part of the playground that's there. This is something we call part of Swing Valley. And our whole idea of play in the city is to offer kids things that they're not going to have at home, and especially interface with nature. A lot of kids in cities don't have much, or even in suburbia don't have much. And so this kind of intense integration of nature and play together is one of our ideas. Next, please. Also on Pier 6, there's sand volleyball, as Joanne mentioned, and then you kind of look up the main promenade back towards the Brooklyn Bridge Pier, which acts as a kind of wayfinding device. Next, please. Another important concept was structural economy. I'm sure this applies more or less to you too. What this means is we looked at the site carefully from a structural capacity, at its structural capacity. What is it capable of doing the way it is? Instead of thinking up ideas and then trying to re-engineer the site to support those ideas, whatever that is, like, oh, I want to make a conference center out in the middle of some place that has absolutely no utilities, you know? So, or in our case here, oh, I want to put a big building out on the pier. Oops, building won't stay up out on the pier. So instead of throwing out those ideas, we kind of did a close reading of the site, figured out its structural capacity, and then put forward ideas to the public that were responding to that after explaining the idea of structural capacity, which did seem a little too abstract for some of them. Next, please. So the idea basically on Brooklyn Bridge Park was to the left on that upper diagram are the piers, which we had several of, and they were 5 acres each in size. And they could have flat, lightweight activities on them, like soccer fields or sand volleyball or things like that, or thin landscapes that could be disturbed to repair the pier. And then on the upland, what we call the upland areas, the parts that are on landfill or on real dirt that could support weight, we could make hills and we could plant trees up out of the 100-year flood line, and we could have, you know, the hope of something lasting a very long time. And so the two images that we talked about that dynamic are on the bottom. Pier 2, which is actually going to open, that's a drawing, but Pier 2 is actually, looks just like that and will open in about a month, Joanne, I think, right? And on the lower right is an idea of this upland kind of more embowered landscape, more traditional park landscape. Next, please. So here another example of that structural landscape. The soccer fields, we have 3 full-size soccer fields on Pier 5. That's how big they are. Thank goodness to all that modernizing of the break bulk shipping. It was a real important editing process in terms of what do you keep and what do you change about the site in order to kind of celebrate its history as well. And so, for instance, here we kept the frame of the old shed, which winds up being a structure that supports the lighting around the perimeter of the park, of the pier. And then also the old wall around the perimeter as well, which contains the balls and helps that way. Next, please. Or on Pier 1, where we could make our 30-foot high mountain and have, in this case, some recycled granite that we made stairs out of from an old bridge and made what we call the granite prospect. We like evocative, we love trying to cook up evocative names. We noticed that Olmsted did that in his projects, had things like the nether mead and things like that. So we try to do our 20th, 21st century version of that. And the interesting thing is all the names have stuck. So other people besides people in the office call this the granite prospect. It's kind of shocking. Next. Or this little vale here, which is again a landforming, all constructed. Next, please. Edge, the complexity of the edge in our case was what we saw was a vital asset. I'm not sure how the edge should be approached on your site, but on our site, that was manipulating the edge was very important. Next, please. And you can see it was very regularized because it was made for unloading ships. It didn't have any complexity to it, no registration of the tide really, which is 5 feet in the harbor, or of course any nature to it as well. Next, please. So we looked at the engineers looked, before we did any design work, we had marine engineers investigate the conditions of the different places on the piers, and the weak spots shown in red there were the places where we said, oh, maybe that's where we could change what's there, because it's got to be changed anyway. And maybe we could put different kinds of solutions in there that will give us connection to the water or connection with nature or something to be more resilient. Next, please. So Joanne mentioned, we actually removed some piers to kind of de-assess them, get rid of them so that a piece of a pier, any one way on Pier 1. Then we cut back an area here and made a salt marsh where we made a kind of engineered natural edge, which is what's happening on the right. The pier is being removed on the left. Next, please. And that gave us this nexus point in the park and a boat ramp, as you can see, left as kind of our free earth art. And next, please. And the salt marsh is growing in. That was the same season it was planted. We should put a newer picture in that shows the lushness of it. But it's a really special moment. And by the way, that was not posed. Those people were really doing that when we took the picture. But this dad and the kid, we used the dad and kid picture. Okay, so next, please. Or other moments of connectivity to the water. We call this the tidal pool, where the registration of the tide is illustrated by the slope of this and how it kind of goes from high to low tide and changes the shape of the thing over the course of the day. Next, please. And then microclimate, not a small issue for you guys. You've got some serious microclimate to deal with out there. And wind and getting out of the wind, and but also, being in the wind and being in the sun are all got pluses and minuses. We had major noise issues, which maybe I just couldn't hear it under the wind when I was out there. But you got exposure issues, and then you got seasonal issues of sun and cold and all of that. And so the design responding to that is very important. Next, please, big motivator. So the BQE here became a challenge for us. How are we going to deal with the noise, the 85 decibels of sound that are coming off of this perfectly engineered cantilever that threw all the noise out onto our site instead of back up into the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood? And so we hired acoustical engineers that design concert halls to collaborate with us. They made a computer model that we tested different things in the model, and were able to redraw the sound contour, if you will, of the site, reducing the sound decibel level. We couldn't have solar power because you can only sell so much, basically as much back as the residents would generate. But we did do things like, for instance, you see here, harvest all of the stormwater falling on the site and falling on our proposed structures and existing structures. Stored that, ran that water through designed water gardens, which are no one knows, or a stormwater filtering system in this park. And then store the water in underground cisterns, which you can see being built here on the right. And when we're fully built out, our engineering models say we'll be covering about 80% of the irrigation needs of the park. Next, please. That's kind of a cool thing to do nowadays, but that was just a cool thing to cut when we did it. Value engineering is the first thing usually value engineered was the stormwater retention system, but we were able, I think mostly because of Wendy's stubbornness, to keep it in the plan. And this is the part of the water garden there. Next, please. And another view of that water garden. Next, please. And then just kind of looking at Pier 1, which is just the kind of northern tip of the park during a movie. And I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Okay, we can leave that up.
And I'll get us started off with a couple of questions. And so the first one is, it sounds like you went to the Outer Harbor today, and so it's great to hear from some fresh eyes. And I'm curious, what struck you most about it in terms of a big challenge and a big opportunity when you looked at the site?
Well, obviously, you could tell from my comments that I feel like a constituency is very important for a park, and one that is near the park is ideal, obviously, and so people living near the park, I think, are very important, and also connectivity between the park site, the project site, and the kind of established neighborhood are all important. But there are lessons of Brooklyn Bridge Park that are immediately applicable, and then there's a lot of invention that needs to come out of your particular circumstances. We never design a project the same way. If you look at our website, you'll see nothing looks the same. And every single thing has to be a collaboration with the site and its circumstances. And so how that would be handled here is, I can't tell you off the top of my head, although I know that connectivity is a challenge. And the other challenge, obviously, is the opportunity, which is the sublime vastness of the site. That's the great thing about it, and it's also the challenge, because it's approaching sublime in its vastness.
Thank you, Matthew. Joanne, yeah.
Sorry. So there are structures on the site that we observed that are not maybe technically at the site. It's not clear to us exactly what the status of all this, all the various parts of the site, what the status is. But and we were told that the terminal parts of the terminal site were to be something. I guess maybe I don't even know whether they're who owns them at this point, but that they were to be developed as a manufacturing facility, and that maybe that's fallen through. So one thing I would just say is that when we did our initial plan with Matthew, we did think about keeping some pier sheds up. And in particular, we thought about keeping one up for an indoor recreational facility, which was very popular among a lot of people because there wasn't a lot of indoor recreation nearby in Brooklyn, and we wanted it to be a 12-month-a-year facility. Later, it developed that the pier shed was inadequate because the column spaces were not wide enough to create sports spaces that were useful, and so we ended up having to take down the pier take down the pier shed, and we don't have an indoor recreational facility.
That's where the soccer fields are.
In the park, right. That's where the soccer fields are now. We've talked about the possibility of putting up a bubble over them, and we haven't been able to get an operator to respond to RFPs for that. But indoor recreation on a site, it occurs to me that indoor recreation on a site such as this, where you do want to have people using it year-round, and the conditions in the winter may be harsh, although we also hear that there's a lot of revival of winter sports that used to be more prevalent in Buffalo coming back, which is great. But if there were a structure on the site, one might think about ways it could be reused for perhaps an indoor recreation facility, keeping in mind that our experience is that the best one can hope for is financial neutrality. That if you want it to be a park for everyone and you don't want to charge unmanageable fees, but very minor Y-type fees for services, then it probably will not earn money, but it can break even. So I throw that out there.
Thank you.
One other thing, in terms of park planning that I see everywhere, is very much an interest in vigorous engagement with the environment, especially, maybe ironically, younger urban transplants that have come from other places. They want to come to a city like Buffalo because they can live in the city, but they could also have great proximity to the rustic aspects. And if you offer that in the park, I think, for instance, there's a big, and I'm not saying this applies to you necessarily, but rock climbing, maybe silo rock climbing in your case, is huge. Canoeing, kayaking, this kind of more engaged kind of Eddie Bauer approach to the environment is very, very popular with the younger set. So, and that's kind of hard for old fogies like me to understand sometimes.
Well, and the breakwater that you have out there does offer an opportunity for protected water. So we've got protected water in our park between the piers, and we've lifted the platform so that you can actually go under, and we're using that for protected water kayaking. So you already have a breakwater.
A stunning breakwater. I could not believe it.
So you went through this process of analyzing potential revenue sources to obtain financial self-sufficiency, and you settled on housing as sort of the linchpin. Are there lessons that we could learn from ideas that didn't work, or that you rejected or considered, what turns out not to be a very reasonable way to raise revenue from a park, or didn't in your case? Are there any lessons learned there for us?
Well, I think there are a limited number of options when you start to look at what kinds of things you could have in the park to generate revenue. The Port Authority initially was looking at commercial development as in office space. And as I understand it, Buffalo has plenty of office space, and that would not be a particularly good use here anyway. You could have retail. We looked at all kinds of retail, big box retail. It takes up a huge amount of space, it brings a lot of traffic, and you don't get much bang for your per square foot buck. And no one wanted big box retail. They weren't interested in bringing a lot of people there for that instead of the park. We looked at other kinds of markets and restaurants.
Parking. Look at parking.
Parking.
They
It
use
turns
parking
out-
on Hudson River.
Right, on Pier 40 in Hudson River Park is generating a huge amount of revenue for that parking. And in fact, the local community will not allow them to redevelop that pier because they don't want to give up the parking. We thought that was a really bad place to be. And so did the community, because they did not want to have this park generating more traffic. They wanted people to come to this park by public transportation. And we were trying to figure out ways to, in fact, we even looked at the subway system. We have many, many subway lines that travel under this site, maybe 8. And so we were trying to figure out, could we take one of those lines and actually create a station that could be Brooklyn Bridge Park Station. And there was only one line where it seemed feasible, because you have to create a station on a flat surface, not when the tunnel is going up. And so we found one line that met that criteria, but it turned out to be just too difficult from an engineering point of view to have an additional stop. It would be the same stop, but it would be another, you would go through the station to one end or the other end. But it turned out not to be possible. We looked at elevators that might drop down over to BQA. We looked at all kinds of crazy stuff in order to avoid parking. So yes, we have a little parking. We have parking in each of the development sites. Some of that's for the people who live there. Some of that is public. But we were not interested in using parking as a revenue generator because it was so controversial insofar it was going to have a bad impact on the rest of the neighborhoods. So that was our situation. But here, there's no neighborhood. So, the parking may make a lot more sense here. And things like restaurants, and there are a lot of smaller things. I mean, we in fact have a cultural facility going in to one of our historic buildings. And what we find with that is that culture, again, is not a net revenue producer. We're going to break even on the site. We're giving it to them for a very minor ground rent. But they're an established theater company. They are putting in the capital to repurpose this beautiful building, and we feel like that's a real benefit to the park. Another one of our development sites is a group of 7 warehouses from the post-Civil War era, and it's a shell that needs complete renovation. And that particular building was on the market many, many different times when state parks owned it, and they tried many different RFPs to get something going there, I think 4. And now with so much park built and also Dumbo, the adjoining neighborhood, being so popular and developed, finally that building has value. And we put out an RFP and signed a contract for the renovation of that building, which will have on the ground floor markets, food markets and restaurants, some galleries. We'll have some public space for the Historical Society, and then it will have high-tech offices that want to have offices there. So, you have to be a little bit, the economy may change during the process. But I think you have to look at everything and be realistic about what's possible. As Matt pointed out at one point, is our restaurants are not able to survive in the winter. So our concessions are open really from May 30th until late October. And then they close for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but they just can't sustain themselves. So I think you have to be realistic about what's possible.
Turns out that white wine is very important. In our case, it might be Labatt Blue or Genesee Cream Ale, but lesson learned. A couple of questions about the timing and the phasing of the project, and if you could just explain a little more sort of what happened when and how you approached phasing things in, but also the timing from sort of idea to completion.
Well, there's construction phasing. How it actually got built, in what order, and then there's also the different phases of the development, and I think we've more or less covered that pretty well. I think, the kind of the early period with Brooklyn Heights plan, and then the LDC period, and then the kind of more concrete plan that developed between 2003 and 2008, which is basically what's being built now with additional refinements as we build out. One of the things I think is important about that, as it dovetails into construction, is it was impossible, because it would have been too much, and also we didn't have all the money, to build the whole thing at once. And that turns out to be good, because what we did is we kind of built in from the entrances, from what we were calling the urban junctions here. And so we introduced people to the idea, and then we kind of made more, and then we made more, and then we made more. And the neat thing about that is kind of small refinements in the design that you learn from what you did already can be incorporated into what you do next. And I think flexibility in the plan, and I don't mean basically non-committal, being non-committal. It was a very radical plan in a lot of ways. Idea of in-water uses is kind of the idea of the revenue generating uses, the kind of, a lot of the programmatic ideas are very out there, but on the other hand, we tried to be open about, for instance, the concessions and how they can evolve and change over time. We made places for them, kind of not expecting it to work at first, but maybe it will work later after the park gets developed. And one of the ideas about uses on the site that I was floating at lunch today was the idea of kind of temporary use on the site, and taking advantage of the fact that it's temporary and adaptable therefore, you know, and say you had some different kinds of festivals or activities that brought people out that could then adapt and change every year, the kind of the same thing but different, reinvented, more of this and less of that, whatever, you know, was working. Keep yourself nimble. I think that's very, very important, especially in these early times when you're testing things out.
Thank you. Joanne, anything to add on
Just
time?
that I think, you know, we did a lot of interim use in Brooklyn Bridge Park for the very reason that we wanted to engage people and keep them interested and bring them there. And I think there are a lot of things you could do to engage local institutions in that kind of program with you. Whether it's, you know, a museum or art galleries. And I'm sure there are a gazillion indigenous organizations in your area that would love to have a venue. And I think the people of Buffalo would love to see them.
Contemporary art, the contemporary art world is in love with sites like you have. In fact, they prefer them to museums. So, you know, a changing art program that brought people out. It's also spectacular enough that it kind of drags them out there and then they see it.
Any other interim uses you did? Any temporary uses that people?
To a temporary pool that was put in very expensively for a few months, but was a wild success. So a floating pool, you can believe it. People actually had to wait in line for 45 minutes to get into it. Didn't make an ounce of sense to me, but they all loved it. So, you know, you never know. I certainly never know.
Okay, we've just got time for, I think, maybe one more of our questions. A question about the housing. Someone wants to know, is it all market rate, or is there some affordable, or what's the mix?
The approach that we put forward, by the way, we were allowed to use 20% of the site, of the project site, for the revenue generating use. Because we were able to bring 360 Furman Street in, which was already 4 acres in size, because we could reuse the Empire Stores, which Joanne just described, the old warehouse, we were able to have about 4.5 acres of land already existing, turning that into revenue generating uses. We added another 4 acres, coming up to 8 or 9 acres, to cover all of our needs. And so we were ultimately, in the end, we came in at under 10% instead of under 20%. And that had to do with, for one thing, not using market rate housing.
No, using market rate.
I mean, that's right, using market rate housing. Our argument was, that we told everybody, and we got the reaction to it, was, well, if you want low-cost housing, then we'll just need more of it, because it's not going to make any money. And the idea here of the housing, mostly, is to make money, to pay for your enjoyment of the park. And nobody liked that answer, but everybody knew it was right.
Right. And I think to be clear, that our last development site, which is the only one that's left, for Pier 6, will have affordable housing. We're not sure exactly how much affordable, and also, as you know, the issue of what is the definition of affordable housing is a very fluid one. We're basically waiting for decisions to be made at City Hall, but they are very supportive of this financial model that we have, and we have said that we are very willing to do affordable housing to the extent they want us to. And we've crunched the numbers very carefully. We know exactly, since we've done everything but this, we know exactly how much more money we need for our model, so that when we are fully built out, we'll have enough revenue to cover our expenses, and we feel comfortable that because we've been in a housing boom and we've done very well with some of our other development sites, that we'll be fine and are happy to have affordable housing in Brooklyn Bridge.
All right, you were so succinct. I'm going to ask you one more of our audience questions while Joan and Joni come up to close us out. And that is, what did you do to attract wildlife to this site? Our site is very rich in wildlife. It's an international flyway. Curious about some of your strategies when it comes to the fauna.
Right. Well, we had a site that had no ecological diversity, to say the least.
Rats.
And so we looked at it from an ecological perspective. How can we create a lot of niches within that environment? And so we reshaped the land, and we reshaped the interaction of the land with the water to create a lot of ecological variety, which then supports a whole host of different communities, plant communities, which then support a whole host of different kinds of wildlife. And we're looking for opportunities. And of course, wildlife competes with people in parks as well, right? But opportunities come out of the funniest places. So for instance, on the sound attenuating landform that I showed the cross section of, the BQE side, of course, is not habitable by humans. But it is something that you look at from Brooklyn Heights. So we made a wildflower meadow there. That is great bird habitat. Probably more, proportionally than you'd have any other way. The salt marsh and the water gardens was immediately adopted by wildlife, and it's full of wildlife now, including a muskrat, which was eating all my plants, dragonflies and all of that. And so we preserved a nature island, which is being finished right now, where we kind of created we cut off a piece of land away from the shore, isolating it from predators, dogs mostly, cats, so that birds can colonize it. And that will happen. It's amazing how fast the wildlife moves into places when you make a place for it.
I would just add that we also, thanks to Matt, have guides of the not just the wildlife but the flora in the park, and it's almost all native species. It's all there for a reason. It sustained very little damage during Sandy when the park was completely covered in water, and we have a lot of free programming. So we take people who sign up on nature walks, and we have volunteers who walk around and show them all the different plantings and explain to them what they're doing there. And so we have a huge amount of public programming that helps engage people in everything about the park.
Free programming to the people who are enjoying it. It's
yes,
not
of course we have to
actually-
raise money for it. I'm sorry.
You're perfectly clear. I just don't want anybody to think that it's just a bunch of Girl Scouts volunteering to do it. There's a whole organization called the Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy, which was given the responsibility ultimately to invent and run the programming in the park, and they
raise about $2 million a year.
And they approach it very creatively, and so they're changing new things, or trying to figure out what to do, what do people like, what's successful, what's not, so it's quite interesting.
They have people who are learning how to ride bicycles, they have
yoga classes,
they have reading under the Brooklyn Bridge, they have a lot of really, really interesting programming and they bring school groups. We're about to have, we just got a new piece of property from the city, which has a building on it. It's going to have environmental programming, which we've been doing, but not in an organized way because we didn't have a setting for it. And those classes for kids in public schools are going to be building. So there's a lot going on, and that's all designed to bring people there and connect them with this wonderful resource.
That budget doesn't come out of the operating budget. That's its own independent budget.
We can't thank you enough for all the wonderful ideas that you've presented today. But we do have two pieces of business that we still want to finish up with. Joan Boser, who is a huge fan of Frederick Law Olmsted's, has a special gift for each of our speakers.
How can we ever thank you for your generosity? so much for sharing all this information with us.
And-
I'm going to look for you. I think this is yours.
Frank, would you stand up so we could recognize you? And our second piece of business is George Grasser, who is sponsoring the Congress for New Urbanism in Buffalo.
Right. Some of you may not know what the Congress for New Urbanism is and why we're bringing it to Buffalo. It's probably the only venue or the only event where all the disciplines get together. Architects, planners, transportation people, activists, and they're coming to Buffalo. It will be probably the largest Congress ever. It will be the most intense Congress ever. It will have the most public events that are open to the public than any Congress. And it's coming, and you can still register. You have sheets, pink one, all the free events, and the blue one is a summary of the Congress, which I change all the time as things develop. And I encourage you that we have 50 educational sessions, including one that Frank Kowski will be on, Olmsted versus Moses. And our keynote opening speaker, Joanne mentioned him, is going to be Ken Greenberg from Toronto, and we have some wonderful presenters. We have Piazzanito coming from Mexico City, the masked champion of the pedestrian. So he will be here too. So we hope you participate in the events, lots of open events for the public, 2 great noontime lectures too. So we hope to see you there.
Thank you, George. And now I just want to thank our wonderful guests and Sam Magavern for moderating. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And I hope that this forum has stimulated some creative thinking, so that I hope it's planted some seeds. So we have the possibility of doing something really terrific here. We've got the site. We could connect so much together, and our whole idea is to make Buffalo a phenomenal destination and an exciting place to live and be and want to be. Thanks so much.